Earlier this week I gave you my ranking of every boss in Nightraign's Forsaken Hollows DLC, so now it's time to feed that into the full Nightreign boss ranking and see how this new crop of encounters stack up against the bosses from the base game. Of course, as always, do me a favour and remember that this is just my subjective opinion on this subjective medium and is no superior or lesser to anyone else's. Many of you won't have even fought this boss. It's the only one here which isn't a part of the traditional expedition gameplay. Instead, it's actually tied to the Remembrance side quests, and thank God it is. Of course, it would be better if it just didn't exist at all, but if it was an encounter we had to face while working towards the fight with the Night Lord, there would be many a justified crash out, because this is a terrible boss. You have to kill the Revenant herself. She's the one who affects the health bar, but she's supported by 3 summons, those the class can bring forth with their ability. The High Page is infamous for being one of Elden Ring's most frustrating enemies, with vastly superior speed to the player and a crossbow that feels more like a Fortnite gimmick weapon than one from Elden Ring. There's also the Pumpkinhead to pressure you and the Skeleton to punish you if you go anywhere near it. You'd think with all these enemies the arena would be sizable, but no, it's half the size of an Evergel. And bear in mind, half of that you have to avoid like the plague unless you want the Skeleton to shred your health bar. Speaking of shredding health bars, the Revenant herself has plenty of spells which deal way too much damage and can be a real problem while you're fighting her minions. The Discus of Light is just awful. Opinions on bosses in these games always differ drastically since everyone has different preferences, but the most universally hated types of boss are poorly considered gank fights like the Godskin Duo, and bosses that see regular enemies dumped in a room like Prowling Magus and Congregation, or Silksong's Growl that I've just spoken about in my latest video. The Revenant ticks both these boxes and plenty more, all adding up to an utterly embarrassing excuse for a boss fight. Elden Ring provided us with a strong gimmick boss utilising the all-reliable Stormruler and Rykard. Nightreign utterly failed to replicate that success. Maris was the weakest boss in the starting roster, and nothing changes with the supposed upgrade. It remains just as dull as ever and adds some incredibly frustrating moves to the fold. The giant AoE wave is incredibly obnoxious, the Tell is nowhere close to clear enough, and if you're too close to Maris when it uses this attack, you are going to take damage. Lots of it. It does so much damage and drains your flask so quickly. On top of that, there are many situations when you can't even see the boss since it decides to fly directly above you. Maris moves around an unnecessary amount and makes it incredibly frustrating to destroy the Purple Lords, since the boss just doesn't feel like hanging around. FromSoft gave players a ranged weapon, which on paper should amend a lot of the issues with the original Augur. Unfortunately, the developers are like Drickus Duplessis. They can't read. The fight still largely consists of mindlessly chasing down the boss to actually deal any damage to its egregiously vast health bar. But absolutely the worst element of this fight is how it completely invalidates most everything you do on the 40-minute run back. The weapons you find don't matter, most buffs you can get don't make a difference, and worst of all, your choice of character is almost entirely disregarded. It's an awful fight that makes Nightraign's worst boss even worse. I've seen plenty of memes about how Wormface is one of the worst bosses to see at the end of the day in Nightreign, and yeah, I agree. It's not difficult, it isn't frustrating, there's not much risk of dying here as long as you're paying attention to your Deathblight build-up. In fairness, I think conceptually as minions dropping Deathblight crystals is really cool, and a nice way to vary the fight from their Elden Ring base game encounter. Unfortunately, it isn't mechanically engaging. Rats are one of the worst enemies in Souls, and the crabs aren't exactly fun to fight either. Wormface just doesn't translate well to Nightreign, and while I appreciate what FromSoft tried here, it just isn't an enjoyable fight. Adele was already one of my least favourite bosses in Nightreign, and his Everdark variant just made him worse. He retains all the extreme jankiness in both his moveset and the camera, and just accentuates the frustration with the giant tornado forcing the player to run away and stalling out the fight to a frankly annoying degree. Ah yes, running away. Riveting gameplay. I don't like any of the changes they made to Everdark Adele. They do nothing to amend the issues I had with his original fight, and everything they added was a detriment to what was already a poor fight, making it ultimately really lame. Well, we all know everyone absolutely loves having ads dumped in the boss fight. Everyone adores NPC-style enemies. Nobody's ever had issues with those design choices, especially not me. To be fair to Libra, his Everdark variant wasn't bad for the reasons I expected it to be. I liked Libra's regular fight, but I wasn't oblivious to its flaws. The magic spam became very frustrating at points and reeked of an overlooked element of the boss. And given the changes made to the previous Everdark Sovereigns, I expected the magic spam to be turned up from 1 to 100, artificially increasing the difficulty difficulty. Thankfully, Ishizaki didn't take the boss in this direction, to my surprise. Unfortunately, there's a whole new reason I don't like Everdark Libra: his entourage. I don't like ads. They never enhance the boss in my eyes. They're always a detriment, and here they absolutely are again. It's not even like the movesets of the ads are well designed. They're just given weapons obtainable to the player in Nightreign, and often will simply spam projectiles, another element of FromSoft's poorest boss designs. Libra's own moveset doesn't really get any great new moves. It actually gets diluted to allow the players not to be overwhelmed by his allies, but it's still easy to get swamped regardless. Worse is the lack of a cap on the number of minions Libra can spawn, making it very possible for a team of 3 to get jumped by upwards of 6 NPCs at a time. I do like the curses Libra can cast, especially the one in which he incites a riot. It's just a shame that FromSoft made all the wrong decisions on the conceptual level of Everdark Libra's inception. The Centipede Demon made it near the bottom of my Dark Souls 1 ranking, and it's no better here. One of the biggest issues, the arena, is no longer a detriment to the fight, so it's not quite as bad as the original, but there's been no improvements to the janky, terribly designed moveset, so it's still just not a good boss. Freya was already mediocre enough in Dark Souls 2, becoming unbearable on New Game Plus when the spider's close to one-shot you, and Nightreign takes away the most interesting part of her mechanics, being the player's ability to switch between which side of the boss they fight. It's still present here, but when in a party of 2 or 3 players, you'll naturally just face one side each, which makes the fight nowhere near as interesting. It's not made massively worse by Nightreign, but if you're gonna bring back a boss, you've got to at least do something with it to justify its return. Largely considered the worst Night Lord at the time of release, Maris placed at the bottom of my list then, and I still think of the fights I included in that video, this is the weakest one. Fighting this boss as any class other than I is like walking on hot coals, but not scorching ones, just ones hot enough to be unpleasant. It's so unbelievably boring. It's not even a fight, it's a chase. People, myself included, always complain about having to chase down Mikolash, and while Maris isn't anywhere near as bad, it's the same thing here. Even if you do play as the fight still sucks, since there's basically nothing the boss can throw at you that's actually interesting to engage with. I guess the new kit drops comes kind of close, but most of Maris's moveset is just so dry. The sleep AoE also sucks. For one, the way you deal with it isn't intuitive to figure out. Most players won't realise how to on their first run, leading to what feels like utterly unfair damage that ruins a 45-minute run. Even when you do figure it out, trying to communicate with randoms to save their ults for the boss is basically impossible. With a team of your own it's fine, but for some reason randoms still don't seem to have learned how to deal with it. Everything about this fight, aside from the presentation, which isn't even anything all that spectacular, is plainly unenjoyable. I actually rather liked some of these more creative blends of enemies Nightreign used as the night bosses in the base game. Fights like Tree Sentinel and Royal Cavalrymen are just really unique, but while this is similarly unique, the mechanics unfortunately don't pull their weight. They're 2 of the toughest enemies from Shadow of the Erdtree, with the Divine Warriors in contention for the hardest in the series. Both these bosses are incredibly aggressive, unrelenting, with extremely long combos that dish out equally extreme damage. The best strategy here is to focus the Curse Blade and shred its flimsy health pool as quickly as possible. Fail to do that and you're almost certain to get overwhelmed by the ceaseless aggression of the pair. I just wish they paired the Divine Warrior with another enemy that differed from it more significantly. The Crucible Knights are some of my favourite enemies in Elden Ring, with the one in the Stormhill Evergel being near the top of my boss rankings, but the Golden Hippo didn't do quite so well, falling towards the bottom of the mediocre tier. This fight actually does do something new though, and frankly I can't fault the execution. It uses the classic technique developed by fights like Bell Gargoyles and Man-Eaters, where the second enemy will join the fight when the first reaches half health, but aside from that, there's nothing new here. Both have the same movesets as they did in the original Elden Ring, and though they surprisingly don't make the fight terrible when you have to face them together, they don't exactly enhance each other's movesets either. I'm aware that most people prefer the Everdark variant of Adele. I appreciate the high difficulty, but as explained in that entry, I don't think the additions it made were positive. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know I'm generally not a fan of big beast bosses, leaning more towards refined duel style fights. Adele is as much a big beast as you can get, and he carries all the issues I have with them. He fills most of the screen, his attacks feel janky due to his erratic movements, and it can be difficult to distinguish their tells. I don't think Adele is terrible, but I simply don't enjoy this encounter much. It doesn't do anything particularly terribly, it doesn't spawn ads in the arena or have damage the player can't possibly avoid. It's just so far from the kind of fight I enjoy. The Grafted Monarch at least does add some slight variants on Godric's original moveset, but he's far from making any notable improvements. I don't dislike this fight, I'm never unhappy to see it, but there's just nothing of value brought to the table, unlike many of Nightreign's other night bosses. While the original Lord of Blood was a really solid fight from Elden Ring's base game, this rehash completely lets it down. As with his brother the Fell Omen, who was a massive step down from Morgott, this fight loses a lot by virtue of being a less significant encounter with boss we've already fought. To their credit, they do add some new mechanics, much like Nightreign's Fell Omen did, but where those added to that fight, the changes made here are only detrimental to the experience. The tridents the Lord summons just have far too much health, and destroying them feels largely pointless anyway, since he just summons more the moment you do end up getting rid of one. It's just such a step down from the original fight. I am not a fan at all. The Death Knight is one of the best mini-bosses from Shadow of the Erdtree, but after beating the first boss, I definitely felt like, damn, that was too easy. But of course that wasn't the end of the night, and FromSoft dropped 3 more knights in to avenge their fallen comrade. They gel reasonably well together for 3 regular enemies mindlessly dumped into a boss fight together. The fight works thanks to Nightreign's free-player oriented gameplay, but it's definitely not as engaging as the rest of the bosses higher up on the list. It's just fine. The Gaping Dragon was one of the more controversial placements in my Dark Souls boss ranking. I'm actually very fond of the fight and had it in the upper echelon of that game's bosses, but it just doesn't work well here. Not at all. The slower paced moveset doesn't remotely translate to the immense pace of Nightreign. It's far too simplistic and clunky to gel with Elden Ring's combat system. You can clearly see the age of Dark Souls 1 in this fight. I loved it in that game. It worked excellently with the tools provided to you, but in this reuse it falls alongside so many other big beast style fights as a resoundingly mediocre boss. This demi-human duo employ a similar design strategy to the Crucible Knight and Golden Hippo, in slapping 2 separate bosses from Elden Ring's base game together to make a gank, but in this case it's handled slightly better. Being one of the night bosses for Gladius's expedition, it poses a solid challenge for new players unfamiliar with Nightreign's mechanics, and forces them to adapt to the strategies they can use to overcome these obstacles. The Queen and Swordmaster actually go surprisingly well with one another, and there's not too much conflict created by the clashing of their movesets. It's a surprisingly passable boss, though it's still not exactly anything remarkable. The Bell-Bearing Hunter definitely doesn't meet the criteria that qualifies a boss for this list. He changes nothing from his base game counterpart, he's just had his stats flipped and been put in Nightreign, but he's harder. So much harder. Since there's been so many memes about how terrifying this aura merchant is in this game, I figured I just had to include him. He's honestly not as bad as people say. The random aggro switching can catch you and his damage output is insane, but his moveset itself isn't hard to deal with. I appreciate this boss more for the urban legend nature it's taken on, so while I don't find him massively fun to fight in Nightreign itself, he manages to climb the ranks to the meta. The first returning boss players will encounter as part of this DLC is yet another example of a boss from Dark Souls being brought back for a much lesser fight. The demon duo aren't anywhere close to as good here as they are in the Ring City. It's just a pretty boring battle now. There's no concern of managing aggro since they have to split their attention between 3 players. There's no real decision making at play. You just pick one at the fight's inception and keep attacking that same demon until the fight's over. It's not bad by any means. The original boss was thankfully really good, but here they're lacking a second phase and overall just don't work anywhere close to as well. We've just discussed the first phase of this fight that takes place on night 1, and now it's time to talk about the Demon Prince. While the duo didn't do much in the way of switching up the mechanics of that encounter, this fight does actually offer some new mechanics, such as the double grab attack. It spices up the original Demon Prince slightly. I still don't think it's anywhere near as enjoyable as that classic fight, but it's at least a slightly more engaging encounter than the night 1 duo. The Fell Omen is basically just Morgott translated to Nightreign. Thankfully, he's one of the best bosses Elden Ring has to offer, and his moveset does get spiced up a little with the new blood arts. The way players approach the fight is notably different in a free-player expedition than how we fought Morgott in Elden Ring, and it's a worthwhile change that makes this boss stand out as one of the more enjoyable night bosses. Caligo was my favourite boss in Nightreign behind Hellstor, but unfortunately this is yet another case of the everdark Sovereign weakening the encounter. Caligo was already a fight with notable flaws, though they didn't take away from my enjoyment too much. But here they gave the dragon such a vast health bar that these issues are accentuated to an immense degree. His scattering of ice around the map can prevent you from really closing in on him and drag the fight out a fair deal. This is paired with his constant flying around the arena, dragging the encounter out even more. Chasing him down isn't quite as bad as in Maris's fight, but it's never fun regardless. As far as his new attacks go, I am a fan of them, especially the one where he blows up the crystal to create a small tornado, since unlike Adele's it doesn't force you to run too far and you can actually still attack the boss if you stand behind him. But none of his attacks really enhance the fight, and when the vast health bar has such a hugely negative impact on it, a couple of enhanced moves just aren't enough to redeem it. I would have expected to hate this boss, but it's actually executed fairly well. It's perfectly tailored for Nightrein's free-player oriented gameplay, and while they do still change targets erratically, they're actually much more consistent than the dog trio in Gladius's second phase. The Tree Sentinel is already a great enemy, and the horseback Lanedale Knights are excellent choices for his crew. Even the Draconic variant is still pretty solid. The fight is just really well designed overall, and while it doesn't bring anything special to the table, what it does have to offer is well handled. It took a while, but Noster definitely grew on me. This was definitely the hardest boss for me when Nightreign released. It probably took me 7 or so runs to finally defeat it. I still feel the mechanics of the fight aren't the most engaging, but surprisingly it's a really well balanced gank fight. The beast we now know as Fortis Stone Shield has a simple but solid moveset, and he's backed up well by Noster himself. While I do take issue with the columns of light that track you, as they really harm the pacing of the fight, and the AoE roar is too unforgiving in the time the player gets to escape its radius, I do have some level of enjoyment with this duo. From what I've seen, most people seem to think the everdark Sovereign version is a pretty weak fight. It's apparently very unpopular in the community, but obviously I disagree with that, and you'll be seeing that fight higher on the list. Gladius's quality is all in the spectacle of the encounter. The arena is epic, and he's the final grand challenge after a run of Nightreign, and his design is certainly a standout, but that's where the positives come to an end. I do admire pretty much everything they tried here, and genuinely see the vision for what Gladius could have been. Unfortunately, he suffers the same flaws as so many big beast style bosses with erratic movement that make it feel like a much less methodical, skillful back and forth, and more like a scramble to get hits on the target as he leaps around the arena. He's designed to be fought by 3 players. The pseudo phase 2, where he splits into a trio of Dark Souls 3 teleporting dogs, is clearly intended to work around this style of play, but work it does not. The dogs don't aggro to any player consistently. It's not a case of them attacking one player each. It's not a case of them attacking the player that attacks them. They instead seem to randomly pick a player and bounce between them with no level of consistency. And when it's such a vast arena, which it has to be for his moveset, it can be incredibly difficult to chase the dogs down to actually deal damage. Gladius is a boss that could have been great, but is an unfortunate victim of FromSoft's lack of mastery of the design of beast type enemies. Gladius's Everdark variant is essentially just an improvement to his original fight. It doesn't reimagine it or alter any of the mechanics drastically, it just adds some more depth and difficulty that all feels like a fair and natural evolution of the boss. It's more engaging and is certainly a more varied fight. It really just does everything better than the original. So while it doesn't change it enough to make it some phenomenal boss, it does at least climb the list higher than base Gladius. The Nameless King is a boss I know I don't think as highly of as most. I do really like him, but I don't think he even cracked my top 10 in my Dark Souls 3 ranking a few weeks back. Most of my issues were due to the first phase battle against the King of the Storm, and Nightreign actually solves most of my issues with that phase, thanks to its more elaborate movement and wider variety of player tools. But ultimately, it is just a boss lifted from a previous game with nothing new really added, and all the challenge it originally had is completely lost. How high can it really deserve to be? If you've seen my Dark Souls 3 boss ranking, you'll know how highly I regard Dancer. She just about made it into my top 10 bosses in Souls at the end of last year. She retains most of those great qualities in Nightreign, but much like many other returning bosses, she doesn't change much of her moveset and simply wasn't designed for 3-player combat. She's definitely one of the harder Night bosses, and one of the best since her moveset is so excellently designed, but it's impossible for her phenomenal quality to translate in this format. The Smelter Demon is one of my favourite bosses from Dark Souls 2, especially the blue variant found in the Iron King DLC. Not only does Nightreign bring it back, but it combines the red and blue forms into one boss, making an entirely fresh encounter. Despite those positives, it doesn't change the moveset, and wasn't designed to fight against 3 players, or even 2. I'm sure in solo runs it's an incredibly fun Night boss, but when accounting for Nightrein's intended gameplay consisting of 3 players, the Smelter Demon fails to adapt and becomes incredibly easy. Still very fun though. I've seen Libra be one of the community's favourite bosses in Nightreign, and while I do like him a good deal, I have to be honest that he's fallen down my list since my initial video ranking the Night Lords. There's a lot of positives here, but there's plenty of negatives as well. I like pretty much all his moves in isolation, they're all really well made, but Libra suffers from an issue many sorcerer bosses face: spam. Admittedly, it's nowhere near as bad here as it typically is. There's clearly way more thought put into his design, but it's still an issue. The worst offender is the Frenzy Pillar AoE, which you can just rip out of nowhere, and if you don't react immediately, that's half of your health bar gone. Worse is when he pairs it with some other attacks, particularly when he goes immediately into a melee combo, since it's near impossible to time your roll to avoid both attacks. As I said, there's a lot I like about Libra, but there's nothing I love. Nothing that would put him in the great tier and beyond, even without the slight negatives I do have. He's solid, just not as special to me as he is to almost everyone else. This boss serves as a tutorial of sorts, an introduction to the DLC, and it's pretty solid at that. He does feel very basic, his movement isn't anything massively complex, but if you're a regular of this channel, you'll know I never let simplicity restrict a boss being renowned as great in my rankings. Just ask Udex Gundyr. The moves he does have are all really good. His sweeping melee strikes feel similar in a lot of ways to the melee attacks of Libra, though I definitely prefer them here. His AoE has a very clear tell and is incredibly fair to the player, much more so than AoEs typically tend to be in these games. His visual design is also top notch, as are those of all of Nightraign's bosses. Having this be the player's introduction to the new characters is awesome as well. Their inclusion in the fight is a great touch. Much like Demon Souls' Vanguard Demon, you don't get to rematch this boss if you die to him, at least not as far as I'm aware, but he definitely fills this role much better and provides a more solid mechanical challenge. Thankfully I managed to defeat him, but I did hear from my friends that they both got one shot by his attacks, which is annoying and not something I'm typically a fan of. I'll definitely need to fight him more to flesh out my opinion on this boss, but as it stands, I'm a massive fan. Unlike most of the other bosses Nightreign revives from Dark Souls, Artorias feels like a completely different fight, and has some really solid changes made. He was already the best boss in DS1, he's in my top 5 in the series, so seeing him back for this DLC was great. The encounter kicks off with an excellent entrance, seeing him drop down on some regular enemies just as he did back in that classic cutscene. Much of his old moveset is intact, with the front flips, thrusts, and melee slashes remaining, but he gains so much more depth to his kit to make him work better with Nightraign's drastically different combat. He gets an insane new melee combo in line with many of the bosses of newer Souls games. His phase transition now can't be interrupted and summons tracking humanities like in the fight with Mediocre. I'll definitely admit, this fight isn't nearly as enjoyable as the original, but it actually gels surprisingly well with Nightraign's free player oriented combat, and it's easily the best night boss in the game. When Nightreign first released, I had Fulgor below Libra in my rankings, but he's since slightly overtaken him. I think he's simply a cleaner fight, one closer to the style of boss I personally gel with, that being FromSoft's classic duel style fights, their oh so recognisable knight with big sword. Fulgor doesn't fit this mold perfectly, but he's far from suffering the issues that face many of the series' big beast style fights. His moveset is great, his design is awesome, he's very well balanced, and the fight overall is just really effectively considered. Unfortunately, he bears one of the same problems as Libra. There's just nothing really special here. I don't think his gameplay is as refined as a boss like Gyobo Oniwa, his presentation isn't close to as good as the Divine Dragon, his lore can't rival the Demon of Hatred. He does everything pretty well, but none of the components of a boss fight are at a truly incredible standard here, so he ultimately has to sit towards the top of the decent tier. I was pleased with the improvements FromSoft made to Darkdrift Knight. They don't massively alter my opinions of Fulgor. I think the quality more or less remains the same, but the everdark variant is clearly the superior fight, even if it does play out largely the same. It's slightly more challenging, more visually distinctive, and just overall an upgrade, as these fights should be, but it doesn't vastly change the fight for the better. It doesn't amend any of my minor gripes with the original, so it falls short of a higher placement on the list. The Balancers are the Night Lord you'll face at the end of the DLC's first expedition, and they're one of the better ganks FromSoft have designed. As all the Night Lords do, their encounter carries immense spectacle. It definitely feels like one of the grandest fights in the series. It truly does feel like you're fighting an army. Individually, the Valkyries' attacks are all really fun to avoid. They have really smooth melee combos and some solid ranged AoEs similar to those used by Elden Ring's Cleanrock Knights. When the pink Valkyrie arrives to the fight in the second phase, it has the best moveset of them all, with some really engaging new combos and moves. The gank is well balanced, there's clear visual and audio cues to clarify when you're about to get attacked by an enemy you may not be focused on. Their aggression is just managed much better than most ganks in the Souls series. But I do have one issue with this fight, a pretty major one. I love that initial resurrection of the angels that kicks off the second phase, but seeing the same happen again, I was disappointed. I don't think the second resurrection really adds anything to the fight, aside from some extra difficulty. I appreciate when FromSoft makes a boss difficult, but I'm not really a fan of when they do so by simply bumping up the numbers on a boss's stats. The encounter is just so long. It's an endurance fight in all regards. For the first two phases, that's fun, but when the angels return to life a second time, it just loses weight. If they'd actually gained some new moves or mechanics here, I would have been fine with it, but no, it's the exact same as the first. I'm not a fan, it just makes the fight feel like it outstays its welcome. While that doesn't take away from the early stages of the encounter, at the end of a 45-minute run, I'm not really looking to be graced with a boss that has far more health than it should. The final boss of the DLC and the face of the expansion, Straghest is definitely its best boss, and one of the better Night Lords in the game. All of its melee attacks provide clear tells and feel great to interact with. They're punishing but fair, weighty but smooth, they're everything you want in an enemy of this bestial nature. His design is almost like a rotten reskin of Manus, while his movements feel very akin to those of Gale's first phase. I really like everything he offers, and as I said in the tutorial fights entry, he actually has a really good AoE. In phase 2 the fight takes on an entirely new level of spectacle, as Straghest leaps from pillars of corpses to perform sweeping drive-by attacks that every Night Lord seems to possess. If it was just his melee elements, I'd love the fight. Hell, even the projectiles he tosses at you or uses to create AoEs are really good. Unfortunately, the Dreadlord commits one of the cardinal sins of boss design. Why would they dump ads in the boss arena? Just why? There was no need, they add nothing to the fight. Ads never add anything to a boss. They always, nearly without fail, make it worse. So why try to break the cycle? Everyone else who does fails. Thankfully, this is one of the least offensive examples of this crime, but that's only because the ads don't actually pose any real threat to you. Even more reason not to have included them. Players still end up just engaging with the Dreadlord himself. The ads weaken what's otherwise a really solid fight, which is such a disappointment to see when FromSoft was so close to giving us an excellent beast fight, a style they typically struggle with. Caligo took the silver medal in my original Night Lord ranking. She's a greater spectacle than any other fight in the game. The visual design here is incredible. Often FromSoft's dragon bosses suffer from not feeling as grand as a fantasy dragon should, or the mechanics making it feel like a very detached fight. Caligo doesn't suffer either of those issues. She's the most impressive dragon fight in the series from a visual perspective, and actually gives you a fight where you're deeply involved in the combat. Initially I found the ice crystals spread on the ground to be really annoying and ruin the pace, but realising you can destroy them made it much more manageable. I still think it's a slightly unneeded mechanic that does harm the fight a little, but it's not terrible. I do really like all of Caligo's moves. They all feel great to interact with, aside from maybe the forward ice breath. The tail attacks and flyby crystal onslaught are my favourites. The main thing dragging this fight down is just how much Caligo moves around. Often a good chunk of the fight is spent chasing her down, but it's nowhere near as bad as in Maris's fight. The visuals, soundtrack, moveset, everything about this boss is really strong, but big beast bosses don't tend to be as riveting an encounter as more refined duels for me personally. While I found Nostra a serviceable yet unremarkable encounter, the Everdark Sovereign shoots up to the very pinnacle of Nightreign's boss roster. It takes a fight I didn't much care for and makes it a pretty great one. It begins with the original opening to phase 2, which is a move I actually quite like, the drive-by. Once you whittle Fortis and Nostra's health down, the true Night Lord reveals itself. Animus Ascendant Light adds an entirely new flavour to the fight, revitalising it as a surprisingly well-handled FromSoft gank. It grants players the freedom to manipulate the boss to tailor the fight to their preference. If you've mastered Fortis more, it might be better to let Animus revive it, or vice versa with Nostra. It's a great approach to managing multiple enemies. Very easily this fight could have become an overwhelming frenzy to survive against 3 different enemies, but instead it enhances the mechanics of the earlier fight. It's made more challenging, more interesting, somehow more visually impressive than it already was, and I still stand by Nostra's soundtrack being the best in the game, and one of the best FromSoft have ever released. I can't effectively describe why I love Animus so much more than the original Sentient Pest, but it's somehow managed to climb all the way to being the runner-up in my ranking of Nightreign's bosses. Claiming the crown as Nightreign's best boss, Hjolstor completely overshadows every other fight in the game. FromSoft's best bosses seem to always be the knight with big sword style enemies, and the Night Lord is the closest thing we get to classics like Artorias and Gale. Phase 1 is a warm-up, with an unusual moveset that somehow doesn't feel overly erratic and janky. Phase 2 ramps up the spectacle massively, having one of the most awesome moves in all of Souls where he splits open the sky and draws on the powers of one of the 7 lesser Night Lords. This is the kind of varied, distinct visual design that elevates a boss to the true upper echelon of the soulsborne roster. I do have one issue with the fight though, one that holds it back from climbing into the series' top 10. It's directly linked to Nightreign's style of gameplay, being primarily designed around 3 players. To balance this, they gave the bosses the ability to switch up their aggression almost randomly, meaning if you don't want to take unavoidable damage, you'll need to stay at range to prevent Hjolstor randomly sliming you out. I'm sure it's not an issue when playing solo, the fight is probably much more enjoyable. I found that to be the case for Fulgur and Animus, but aside from the Night Lords at the end of each run, I simply don't enjoy playing Nightreign alone. The day gameplay is just far less fun to me, so while I really want to fight Hjolstor one-on-one, I haven't jumped into a solo run of his expedition yet. But don't let my minor gripes deceive you. Hjolstor is an absolutely incredible boss, and very close to the top of FromSoft's roster. So there's the list, every boss in Nightreign ranked from worst to best. I hope you've enjoyed this video, even if you may not have entirely agreed. Although, make note that if you don't like and subscribe, I do know where you live, and I'm fully capable of sending a pipe bomb to your house. See you next time.